But first, with a commanding poll lead, at least for now, and with the Prime Minister under a barrage of more friendly fire today, a more confident Labor Party is starting to let slip what an Albanese government would really be like. And trust me, it'll be the most left-wing government Australia's ever seen, a bit like the Biden administration, which campaigned from the centre but is governed exclusively from the left. Or even worse, like Daniel Andrews in his hard left regime in Victoria. Starting with Albanese's budget address and reply and its uncosted, detail-free announcement of at least $2.5 billion on aged care that's now being walked back because they had to omit a promise for more 24/7 nurses only works if we've got the nurses trained in the first place, meaning what Labor's now promising is exactly the same as the Morrison government's already doing. Now, after pretty much me-tooing the government on climate change, Chris Bowen, remember he's the bloke who said at the last election, if you don't like our policy, don't vote for us. Well, he's announced today that if elected, Labor will lobby to host one of the UN's climate change conferences in Australia. He wants to rerun here the jamboree of green left virtue signalling that Boris Johnson presided over last year in Glasgow, or that shocking conference a few years back in Copenhagen that really started the rot. With death and destruction raining down on Ukraine and with the Russian tyrant hinting at nuclear escalation and with his stormtroopers murdering innocent civilians by the hundreds, you think Labor would have worked out that climate change is hardly the world's most pressing problem. The extinction we should be focused on is not that posed by a degree or two of global warming, but an assault on the sovereignty, the human rights and democracy of Western Europe. But like a circus performer that can't learn any new tricks, Bowen wants Australia front and centre in another talk fest that makes power less affordable, less reliable for us here in Australia, while countries like Russia and China just focus on making themselves stronger. Then there was the shadow treasurer Jim Chalmers, the guy that was Wayne Swan's chief of staff when Labor last blew up the budget. Like his leader, yesterday refusing to rule out tax rises, even though tax is already too high and the problem is too much wasteful government spending rather than Australian families having too much of their own money in their pockets.
We're not attracted to the government's tax cap. And the reason we're not attracted to it is because it seems to us like quite an arbitrary cap imposed for political reasons rather than good economic reasons. And clearly, as the economic conditions evolve, we take advice from the Treasury and from elsewhere about the most appropriate settings.
But that's not the worst of it. There's more. Labor's Indigenous spokesperson Linda Burney declaring yesterday that Labor wants the so-called Indigenous voice enshrined in the Constitution. Well, we knew that. But also a truth-telling commission, it's called the Makarrata, established in order to negotiate a treaty between Australia and its Indigenous people. Now, I said treaty. You heard that right. At one level, I'm one of those who prefer to see an Indigenous advisory body, if we're doing anything in this space, put to the Australian people at a referendum rather than just ram through the parliament, which in all sad probability would probably support on a bipartisan basis. I put my trust with the Australian voters. They're far more likely to be sceptical about a body that gives Indigenous people 2 votes and 2 places to be represented, while the rest of us just get 1, rather than politically correct MPs, as I said, putting it through the parliament. But Labor's promise is bigger than all of that. This truth-telling commission is madness. Now, they did it in South Africa at the time that apartheid ended to deal with years of abuses suffered by people there in real time and recent memory. But here in Australia, a truth-telling commission to pretend that anyone alive today can atone for events 200 years ago insults our intelligence and will only undermine Australia's gains in reconciliation. And this idea that a country can even make a treaty with one section of its own population defies legal and moral explanation. The whole notion of a treaty implies 2 Australias: an Indigenous Australia that should never have been usurped, and the Australia that emerged after 1788, and that pays for all of this. Now, naturally, I accept there are historical episodes that should have been different and that there's much we still need to do on Indigenous policy, real stuff that matters, getting kids to school, getting more adults into work and earning their own money. Where it has to happen, making Aboriginal communities safer, at least as safe as the rest of the country. But this idea that Australia is basically an illegitimate country is wrong. It's dead wrong and shouldn't be pandered to by any political party wanting to govern this country. Anthony Albanese wants you to believe that he represents safe change. You can vote for Labor without a rush to change the Constitution. An avalanche of new spending or a blizzard of new rules or an epidemic of political correctness. That's what he's trying to sell. Rubbish. As you and I both know, it's not like that. Now, I don't think the Morrison government's perfect. I don't. You've heard me here before. But elections are a choice. And I'd much rather a government that's often disappointing rather than one that can't help making us poorer, more divided, less confident, and more vulnerable.